On the last PowerPoint, I mentioned that the Cold War was called the Cold War because there's no actual military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis, though, is the closest that we ever get to actual war, our closest encounter with the Soviet Union and the United States. This is the most dramatic event, the most dramatic confrontation between the two nations during the Cold War era, and it happens in October of 1962. Before we can look at the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, we need to back up a little bit into April of 1961. So again, I just kind of want to give a little background to the situation. So what we do know is that Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union had been working with Fidel Castro to create a satellite nation out of Cuba. So Castro at one point had overthrown the government in Cuba, and he now wanted to have this communist nation. And so Castro starts working with Stalin. Of course, this works very well for Stalin, right? Because he wants to have a communist nation. He also likes the fact of working with Castro because now you could have a communist nation. They could have ties with Cuba, which is just 90 miles off the coast of the United States. So that's a little bit of the background with Cuba becoming a satellite nation of the Soviet Union. Of course, the United States, though, our goal was containment. We did not want communism to spread. We, again, kind of gave in to the fact that it had already spread in Eastern Europe. We did not want it to go any further. In particular, we didn't want it anywhere near us, near the United States. So in April of 1961, the United States started to train Cuban exiles, people that had left Cuba to live in the United States. And they started to train them using our own military in hopes that they'd be able to overthrow Fidel Castro. So what happens in April of 61, as I mentioned, is we send these Cuban exiles back in to Cuba, and this is known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Unfortunately, they do not do very well against Castro and his military, and the United States is defeated in just 3 short days. This was a major blow to the reputation of the United States. If you think about it, coming into the Cold War, we were successful in World War I, we were successful in World War II. And so coming into this Cold War with the Soviet Union, we were not used to being humiliated, but we were in this instance as we tried to overthrow Fidel Castro and his government, but were defeated in just 3 short days. When we look at the failure of the Bay and Pigs invasion against Cuba, it's really a failure on 2 parts. Number one, the United States fails to actually overthrow Castro, so that's not great. And the second thing that the United States does, and why this is looked at as a failure, is they actually anger the Soviet Union. And so we're in the midst of this Cold War. There's already this grand tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, with us attempting to go in there and overthrow Castro. That obviously did not help that situation. However, JFK was president at the time, and he was really ready to kind of reassert the United States as a world power. Yes, we had been humiliated with the Bay of Pigs invasion. However, he was kind of sitting there and waiting for the next opportunity to kind of reassert or gain that power back. And that happens in October of 1962. So what happens on October 16th of 1962 is there were United States spy planes. And spy planes were very common during the Cold War. And what those spy planes picked up were photos of Soviet missiles that were actually being transported to Cuba. The result then is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what this means is that the Soviet Union now has missiles in Cuba, 90 miles off of our shore, which means that we are very much within striking distance. So you can imagine the tension that that's going to create in the United States now that the Soviets have us in their sights. Once the United States and President Kennedy are made aware of the Soviet missiles that are in Cuba, that leaves Kennedy with really 4 options. His advisors came together and gave him 4 possible responses to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first thing that he could do is to try to negotiate with Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev is the new communist leader of the Soviet Union. He takes over when Stalin dies. So Kennedy could negotiate with Khrushchev. There are going to be pros and cons to this, right? Obviously, negotiation is always a great step. Try to talk it out, use words, not weapons. So there's positive there. However, might that make Kennedy and the United States look weak, potentially? And also, would that allow time for the Soviet Union to continue to plan for an attack against the United States? But that's the first option. The second option is to invade Cuba, to try to overthrow their government completely. Again, if we look at pros and cons, this could completely eliminate the threat of communism, eliminate the Soviet threat with their missiles off of our shores in Cuba. However, this could also lead to nuclear war, right? This could be potentially a very deadly decision if we try to invade Cuba. We also know that we've tried to invade them once with the Bay of Pigs invasion and failed miserably. So maybe that's not the best option. Our third option is to blockade Cuba. What a blockade would do would be to prevent the Soviet Union from making any further deliveries. Basically, what happens is the United States would take their naval fleet, take a bunch of their ships, and line them up around the island nation of Cuba, preventing the Soviets from bringing anything else there. The problem with the blockade is you're not just preventing Soviet ships, but you're also preventing other ships from coming in there as well. So you could really damage their economy. You're also preventing ships from leaving Cuba. So a blockade is a little bit tricky. It could be seen as an act of war. The Soviets could back down, or they could attack our US ships, which would all be sitting right there for them. The fourth option that he was given is to bomb the missile sites. If you just destroy the Soviet missiles that are in Cuba, that could help us out. However, that could lead to a Soviet Union counterattack. So again, these are the four options that Kennedy was given once he saw that the Soviets were delivering their missiles to Cuba. So what does President Kennedy decide to do? Well, while he is deciding, you have Americans that are waiting in suspense, as the slide says, but really waiting in fear. Many people took to their bomb shelters, especially those who had created them maybe on new homes that they built and they had stockpiled. So people had taken time to go down to their bomb shelters while they're waiting to see what Kennedy was going to do or decide to do in this instance. So what he tells to Khrushchev is this: you need to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat. Okay, kind of saying, hey, look, you are pushing it and you need to get rid of this. You need to stop bringing missiles there. And then what he does is he creates what's known as a quarantine. Kind of ironic in this time of quarantine for us that that's what JFK does, is he creates a quarantine around Cuba. The deal with the quarantine is that it looks exactly like a blockade. However, a blockade is seen as an act of war. If you are preventing ships from coming in or out of Cuba, you could, cripple their economy potentially. A quarantine is a little bit different. It's more of a filter. When you have a quarantine around Cuba, what was happening is that they were preventing Soviet ships from bringing missiles into Cuba. They were not, however, restricting other vessels from coming in and delivering shipments of other goods that are needed for the Cuban people. And so it's the same idea as a blockade, again, where you're surrounding the country of Cuba with your fleet. However, it's used as more of a filter. Whereas a blockade is seen as an act of war, a quarantine is seen as more of a preventative measure. So this gives the United States a chance to not back down, but also to not threaten the Soviet Union. On October 24th of 1962, the quarantine is set, it's established, and now we just wait until the next day, until October 25th. We wait to see what are the Soviets going to do once they reach our line of Navy ships. Are they going to attack us or are they going to turn around? Lucky for us, and I think really for the rest of the world, is those Soviet ships actually turned around. So while the Soviets were no longer delivering any more missiles or offensive weapons into Cuba, there were already missiles there in Cuba. And so that was the next question that Kennedy had to try to answer, is what were we going to do about the missiles that were there? Khrushchev, again, the Soviet leader, informed Kennedy that he would remove the missiles, but only under a couple of circumstances. One, Kennedy would have to remove the quarantine, so take the quarantine away from Cuba. Number two, Kennedy needs to promise that the United States would stay completely out of Cuba, have no relationship with Cuba. That means no trade. Their economies are not tied together at all. They would really have no contact with one another from that day forward, like forever, all right, which is crazy to think. And Kennedy actually agrees. In terms of staying out of Cuba, the United States and Cuba did not start to create a relationship or work with one another until December of 2014. So from 1962 to 2014, the United States and Cuba really had nothing to do with each other. With that agreement, again, we stay out of Cuba. And the other thing that comes with it, and this is an interesting thing that many people do not know about, is that Khrushchev said he would take the missiles out of Cuba, but then he really pushes Kennedy to take his missiles out of Turkey. What we didn't know, what the American public did not know at the time, is we were doing the exact same thing that the Soviets were. The Soviets were storing their missiles in Cuba. We were storing our missiles in Turkey, which is a neighboring country to the Soviet Union. So we also could have attacked them. So again, Kennedy agrees to remove those weapons from Turkey as well. And the crisis is averted. And this is where Kennedy really becomes this American hero and this president that many people look up to.